aunque algunos de ellos no estén en el speaker corner, I ensure that we'll not have problems to talk with them if something needs to further clarification after these presentations. According to what we have thought was the right order, reader will start developing the approach basically on capabilities, on some capabilities. I am not myself an expert on this topic, but since I am more interested to listen, I am happy to share this table. Please share the floor is yours.
Okay, so thank you very much for this extremely kind invitation and the opportunity to come speak with you today. So as always, these conferences turn out different than you expected. So the long talk turned into a shorter talk. Now it's becoming a fast, very brief talk. So it's going to be a 15-minute run into basically a rough and ready brief introduction to the capabilities approach. And I want to particularly, I think, given this format and this stuff, is that to talk to you more about the concepts and the principles behind the capabilities approach in health and health economics. And then we can possibly have a discussion, and if you have any questions on the more specific technical issues, then we can go for that. So at least to motivate you and inspire you, I would like to, in a way, give you this talk. So it is not by coincidence, or I accepted this invitation not because I wanted to come to Granada, which is lovely, but also you will see that the panel represents particular schools of thought. So it's not by accident or coincidence that we have one person who's talking about incomes, one person who's talking about utility or happiness, and another person talking about capabilities. So these are three different approaches, not only about health and healthcare in health economics, but we have a much broader question about social justice and what the correct focus of social justice and social welfare should be. So let me quickly run through it, and I'm going to add a twist to this story, which is that I'm going to actually, in this talk, pay my respects to what I think is an extraordinary health economist who tragically was killed about a year ago, and I want to give some due respect to it. So what the initial talk is supposed to be about and what the invitation is about the measurement of health in these different kinds of approaches. It's a very focused question. It is very much about what is it that we are talking about when we talk about health in these different kinds of approaches, and particularly in the capabilities approach. Since the beginning of the capabilities approach, which I hope many of you, if not all of you, are familiar with, I hope you are, since it began around the early 1980s, the focus has been on the concept of the idea that we should be focusing not on commodities or resources or on utilities, but on what people can actually be and do in their particular environments and lives. This idea of a capability was also translated to health. It was implicit from the beginning, and it was a great concern from various advocates, and still is, that health is a very important capability in people's lives and also broader in social development. So far, so good. However, that basic concept of health as a capability was not specified very clearly, nor did it match with a variety of clinical concepts, public health concepts, epidemiological concepts, and also in health economics. And one of the reasons why I'm standing up here talking to you is that I have been advocating for a concept of health as a capability that syncs with or meshes with our understanding of the concept of health in the philosophy of health and also in clinical care and public health. So the idea normally in clinical medicine or public health is that someone is healthy when they do not have a disease, right? So the absence of health is the absence of disease, and disease is sort of usually a deviation from normal functioning, and this has been a normal way of thinking about it. And I argue, along with many other people, that this is not an adequate conception of health. We actually need a different kind of conception. And the different conceptions that have been available, the one that I'm arguing is that health we should think about as a cluster of beings and doings, what people are able to be and do that constitutes equal human dignity in the modern world. So that's a very loaded, big, rich, thick concept. It's a normative concept, but I think that really what we want to talk about today is not necessarily the discussions on the philosophy of health, which I don't think the other speakers will be talking about. I think what we're really here about is to advocate for our approaches in talking about different concepts of health that we're using, but also thinking about what do we think about the distribution of these things that we focus on, and what is sort of the broader concepts that are at play in our different kinds of approaches. So just to say that I've done my work in the sense that I've given you an initial argument that says, look, we in the capabilities approach, particularly I, have been arguing for health not as the absence of disease, but as a cluster of beings and doings that constitute a life with equal human dignity. This meshes with the theme of the conference in that health is not just about biological functioning. It's about being able to do various things in life, which incorporates and which entails us taking into account different kinds of social environments and social policies. And I will come back to this in the end, but I just wanted to tell you that there is a health concept here that is at play. So what exactly is going on in terms of the debates, not only today in this panel, but more in the literature as well, is that we've got competing conceptions of what health is that we are trying to maximize or distribute through our policies, but also, more importantly, how we distribute it, what are the different kinds of contexts, what are the different aspects that we are willing to include and exclude into our frame of consideration. So at this point I want to give you a little bit of where I'm coming from, and you probably should know this already, or if you don't, I hope that you will take some time to learn about it, is that many of you are focused, say, perhaps in the Spanish health system or thinking about the European health system. I am much more concerned about the global picture. I am very familiar with the US and UK and India and other European countries as well. But really the idea around this concept of capabilities health is not just about, say, developed countries and what kind of alternative that we can use in terms of QALYs or other kinds of health measurements, but this is a global concern trying to figure out how we can address the great health deprivations that are occurring in sort of the human populations. And if you haven't seen it, this is the calculation by the Institute of Health Metrics that uses DALYs, and they calculated very recently that yearly we lose about 1.7 billion years of life. And so this is actually the big picture of what is the lack of health look like in the human population. And the second thing, which is the same group which has measured this, and I don't know if you know this picture, and I apologize that you can't see it, but essentially this is the source of development assistance for health, it's called. So essentially health development assistance to poor countries by rich countries, and you will see since 1990 the dramatic increase in funding. So in 1990, I believe that it was approximately $7 billion US dollars. In 2013, it's become 36 billion US dollars. So this is a very big change in the amount of resources that are going into health programs, and I don't mean health broadly, I mean health care programs and policies in poor countries or in developing countries. So this is because largely due to things like the AIDS epidemic and other kinds of global epidemics, but also due to large foundations such as the Gates Foundation and their large yearly requirements for funding. So the role of health economics could be and is quite significant in trying to both frame our problem of what is it that we're trying to do in terms of morbidity and mortality among the human population, but also the resources that we're spending. And the question is whether we are doing the right thing, whether we're distributing the resources correctly, whether we're getting the results that we want to do. So what does this have to do with the capabilities approach, and what am I trying to say is that the initial thing that I want to talk about is that you all know about utilitarianism. I won't talk about welfareism, but it seems to me that everyone working in health economics at this point considers themselves a extra welfarist, right? So everybody says basically welfarist health economics is old, it's passé, and essentially everybody says I'm an extra welfarist, and then they refer to Sen once in a while, and then it's sort of like sprinkling gold dust on your paper, and then you move on and keep doing whatever it is that you're doing. And I think that this is a big failure. I think that extra welfarism is just a basket that says I'm not a pure welfarist, and therefore, and then also it's about Sen and capabilities, and I think that this is very pushed up. So the one person that I think does not do that in health economics in a significant way, and I hope that you will pay more closer attention, is a health economist named Gavin Mooney, who was who is considered to be one of the founding fathers of health economics. And he worked not only in the UK, but also in Denmark, and then also in South Africa and in Australia. And his book, Challenging Health Economics, to me, is a profoundly important book, which I think says lots of the things that I wanted to say today, and I think you should go and get this book and sort of look at it much more closely. But the thing about Gavin Mooney is that he got what the capabilities approach was about, partly because he understood what the problems in healthcare, and health economics were, and he sought to identify the way that the capabilities approach could address these kinds of problems. So because my long talk has now become a short talk, I'm not going to go into the details, but essentially sort of guide you to these sort of points that I think that you should look at. So if I could give you in 5 minutes a sail about the capabilities approach, what I would say is these 4 things. What we are interested in the capabilities approach is not the amount of money that we are spending on healthcare, not the resources that people have or the incomes, nor are we interested in their preferences purely or their happiness or utility. What we're interested in is what they can actually be and do. And this is profoundly important because there's many ways in which that we measure different aspects of the efficiency or equity of health economics, and we do it incorrectly. So for example, we talk about access to healthcare, but we actually measure use, right? This might seem like a minor thing to some of you, but it's actually very significant. Is that if you actually want to measure access, you need to measure access in a different way rather than use, right? And so when you look at a concept like a capability, what you're asking is, what are the internal and external factors that actually determine whether this person can practically be able to be and do something? And those factors bring in that sort of notion, that frame, that notion of capability allows you to incorporate many different things. Yeah? So this idea of capabilities gives you much more realistic and grounded understanding of what's going on in people's lives, particularly around health. And why this is important for health is that it became very clear when you look at very specific issues around, like such as infectious diseases like HIV or Ebola or SARS, or if you look at health of women and girls, what you find is that health is not just simply about access to commodities, but it's about having control over your body and behavior over your life course. And that notion of being able to have control over your body and behavior is nicely captured in the sense of being capable of doing and sort of being and doing something. So that's one aspect of this, which is that we're interested in capabilities. The second thing is that there is a very strong emphasis on the notion of objectivity in the capabilities approach. This is because, as we saw in the previous talk, the idea of preferences is so important in economics, and it's also so important in health economics. But there's very significant places in which subjectivity or preference elicitation goes wrong. And we need to be able to have an external or objective view on people's assessment of their health status, but also just simply their health capabilities and functioning, and I can go in more into that. The third bit is this idea of freedom, right? So from an ethical and a political point of view, what we're interested in is not the achievement of something, but actually being able to do something, right? So for example, quality, if I understood it correctly, is that you're measuring the achievement, the actual doing of something. Can you do this? Are you doing this, right? But actually what might be important is thinking about the possibility that what we're interested in is, are you able to do it? But the choice about whether you actually do or achieve something is your choice. The kind of life that you want to live is up to you, but the requirements of justice is that we provide the environment in which you're able to have various kinds of opportunities. But perhaps the fourth and most important aspect is this idea of equity. There are many different kinds of equity definitions going around and still continue to be debated. But one of the things that I see in health economics, and which I find greatly troubling, is this idea that if we can simply replace preferences or qualities with a capability measure, then we can simply continue on with maximization. And the idea is that maximization may not always be the right thing to do. There are other equity considerations that we need to pay attention to, and we can talk about all the different kinds that were going on. So in terms of the practical, much more bread and butter work of health economics, there are a number of individuals at present who are developing what would hopefully are useful measurement tools for economic evaluation of not only clinical care but public health interventions. And you have these kinds of acronyms, and I don't know if you know them or not, but the ICECAP and the OCAP and the ASCOT are different kinds of measurement tools that different health economists are trying to develop, or are hoping to develop, are developing, that will complement or substitute QALYs in the allocation of healthcare resources. And so that's much more of health technology assessment, and that's where capabilities approach is going on. But going back to Gavin Mooney's question, and I think my sort of interest as well, is much more broader questions about what is health economics going to do about health inequalities on a broader social scale or a global scale. How do we look at, say, international economic activities, trade, various kinds of population level phenomenon that happen and affect health that cannot be reduced to individual preferences or individual actions. Those are much more of political, ethical, and conceptual work that needs to be done in order for what we would think to be health equity or health justice to be realized. So that is 16 minutes. I'm sorry, I apologize for rushing through what I could do a whole day on, but I hope that at least in terms of reference points, I've given you a couple of things. I've given you a brief thumbnail sketch of what the capabilities approach is about. I've given you a health economist who I think is a really good place to start if you're interested in these kinds of issues. And I've also given you a critique of some of the places that I think the capabilities approach has been misused in health economics. Thank you.
I don't need lights, so if you can see it better without lights, that would be perfect. First of all, thanks a lot for the invitation. I appreciate it very much to get the opportunity to present here in this panel, and I would like to provide an application of the happiness approach, and I would like to use as an illustration tobacco control policy and smoking behavior. I mean, we know that we are repeatedly reminded that there are negative health consequences of smoking. This not only holds for active smoking, but also for passive smoking, as we are exposed to the same kind of carcinogens as when we are actively pursuing this kind of consumption. Maybe too much paper here. In response, in many countries we have tobacco control policies in place, actually aiming at the reduction of smoking. And these policies that are in place are also evaluated in terms of the consequences, often whether people smoke more or less, or whether smoking is effectively reduced. That holds for cigarette taxes, that in the meantime make more than half of the price of cigarettes, but it also holds for smoking bans. Now, this approach is criticized not only by the tobacco lobby, but also from a welfare economic perspective, we might criticize that it's not clear whether regulations that reduce smoking are in fact increasing individual welfare. Smokers are not force-fed geese. So I live in Basel, so we are close to the Alsace, where we are served foie gras, and so this is for me a picture of involuntary consumption. I will come back to that issue later in my presentation, but I think as a starting point to evaluate consumption behavior, this is not a good one. Then second, we might be concerned about substitution effects. So there might be displacement effects, for example, if you have smoking bans in one place, and it's not clear how this affects individual welfare or other people who stay with smokers where they are actually allowed to smoke. So from a policy perspective, a health economics perspective would be that successful tobacco control policy internalizes negative externalities. So we would ask the question, what are the net welfare effects? Or this is the question we actually would like to answer. Now this is very difficult, in particular when the behavioral reactions imply ambiguous welfare consequences, as I've tried to explain before. And it's of course no suggestion, given the title of my presentation, what I propose as a welfare measure, so it's reported life satisfaction. You might immediately start criticizing that this is by far too ambitious to go for an overall net welfare effect, but we would rather like to see what are the consequences potentially on smokers, non-smokers, and wannabe quitters, who benefits, who loses, and so we would be interested in the effects on life satisfaction for different groups. I will try to address this in my short presentation, so I will very briefly say something about measuring subjective well-being. Probably many are familiar with this concept already, and then present my application. Now, measuring subjective well-being is of course an old dream in economics. So Jeremy Bentham actually had a view of economic policy that was very much based on a hedonic concept of utility, and his ideal would have been to evaluate policies in terms of the consequences for pleasures and pains. So today we would maybe say positive and negative affect. Edgeworth was following this vision, and he actually wanted to develop a hedonimeter that would actually then measure directly utility or welfare, and that would work like a thermometer, but he was actually not successful in doing this. Lionel Robbins, he was mentioned earlier this morning. He then actually gave up on this search for a physiological measure of individual welfare or happiness. And he was actually able to put economics on completely new foundation, and these foundations do not require that we have an individual comparable and interpersonally comparable and cardinally measurable concept of utility. So a lot of insights we have in economics that we have in health economics are possible on such a concept. However, there are clear limitations, and we know that from behavioral economics, and I think in the meantime there is a reaction going on in economics. You might consider the happiness revolution, that we think, no, we can do, there are approaches available that we can get at direct proxies for individual well-being. We just ask people. And we think, yes, there is information value when we directly ask people about their individual welfare. So we follow the liberal tradition that we actually rely on people's judgment, as we do when we observe individual behavior. The most simple way is, and this usually takes only a few seconds for people to answer this question, is to simply ask an overall question about how satisfied you are with your life these days, and then people answer these questions, here in this case in the European Social Survey, on a 10-point scale, or 0 meaning extremely dissatisfied, 10 meaning extremely satisfied. What we observe, and this holds for many countries, quite in contrast to Sigmund Freud's idea of a whale of sorrows, that this is not the case. As soon as we empirically start measuring people's life satisfaction, also here for Spain, in the top 3 categories, there are 75 of the people who report to have a life satisfaction level that is rather high. Now, do this information or these reports contain any valid information that we can use for empirical analysis? And here actually psychologists have done research for years, and we in economics, in health economics, we can rely actually on their work. So they have studied correlation between measures that are supposed to measure similar concepts. They have also tried to assess whether, to what extent these responses are interpersonally comparable. And they have actually asked not only the people to report their own happiness, but they have asked friends, colleagues, interviewers to rate other people's life satisfaction. And they found quite some correlation, suggesting that this interpersonal comparability is much less of an empirical problem than it is a theoretical, because theoretically we can, of course, not claim that. A brief remark here: we often do not require full comparability across people in our empirical applications, because we observe the same people over time in panel analysis. So we only require that a person who feels subjectively better off, or who would just his or her life better, would then on average report higher life satisfaction. So it's an interpersonal consistency that we require for many applications. So yeah, let me present very briefly research we are currently doing at the University of Basel. This is joint work with Reto Odermatt. When we start from the policy perspective, and tobacco control policies should aim at internalizing the social cost of smoking. So they should protect non-smokers from secondhand smoke. They might, accordingly, they might motivate smokers to smoke less. So this policy hypothesis can be tested or evaluated in terms of smoking behavior, reactions in smoking behaviors. I will not do that. We are also doing that for Europe, but actually I will focus on the positive, or whether there are positive net welfare effects given this approach. I will skip the related evidence. I mean, you know that there is a tremendous literature on smoking, tobacco control policies and the consequences for smoking behavior. I would rather briefly explain in what data framework we try to study this question. And we are using repeated cross-section data from the Eurobarometer, studying people's life satisfaction over 22 years, involving more than 500,000 observations from 40 countries or regions in Europe. The Eurobarometer not only includes responses about people's life satisfaction, but also some socio-demographic characteristics. They will help us to at least control for some covariates of reported life satisfaction. How do we try to identify the effect of tobacco control policies on people's life satisfaction? So we exploit the staggered introduction of smoking bans in Europe. As you can see here on the right, in the Republic of Ireland, they were the first to introduce actually smoking bans, and then over the years more and more countries joined. So we exploit that not all the countries started to introduce smoking bans at the same time. We also then qualify the smoking bans, whether they only involve the workplace or also the hospitality sector, whether they are more or less comprehensive, and whether they are actually enforced. On the basis of this information, we create an index for the smoking bans between 0 and 1. So 1 would indicate is a very comprehensive enforced smoking ban that holds in the hospitality sector and at the workplace. I skipped this example for Italy. Bringing this information together, maybe I can add, so we have data about cigarette prices and taxes from the European Union. So they have detailed information about the price of the cigarettes of the most popular price category. And we're using this data, and they also have data about the taxes, so the total of excise taxes applicable to cigarettes. So what you can see here is our specification. So the idea would be applying kind of any differences in difference approach. So we try to explain people's life satisfaction and whether this depends on whether a ban is in place and how high cigarette prices are. Then we take into account individual characteristics that have been shown to correlate with life satisfaction in the past. We take into account country-specific variables that might be the rate of unemployment at the regional or country level. Then we take into account the level of life satisfaction across countries, because due to language differences in language culture, you might get rather different levels of life satisfaction. Time-fixed effects, and importantly, we allow for each country and region to have a different trend over time. So average life satisfaction might increase or go down quite differently than the overall development of life satisfaction in Europe. And we only exploit deviation from these trends. And this is important because we only have introduction of smoking bans, but not actually that they are abolished. So what do we get? So I will not explain all the coefficients here, but stick to the last specification, indicating that we have all these control variables in place. And then we have here smoking ban. In our data set that is really big, we have 40 interventions to exploit. We find on average, no partial correlation with people's life satisfaction. For cigarette prices, we actually find a negative partial correlation overall. And the effect size here indicates that for a 50% price increase, life satisfaction goes down about 1/10 of the difference in life satisfaction between employed and unemployed people. And this is, from previous research, we know that this is the single largest difference that we observe in this kind of data. Of course, here this is not, I've seen that this is not statistically significant, so we measure that not very precisely. This exercise so far was without much theory, and actually I would like to take a step back and start with proper hypothesis of what we would expect in the first place. And here actually we have rather different views. I mean, there you have the view that, of course, people, we have to take people with their consumer sovereignty and people actually optimize, and so restrictions might really hamper their pursuit of individual happiness, while we have others emphasizing, no, we are far away from rational consumption behavior because people are addicted. And this is actually reflected in two streams within economics. So we have the traditional economic model with rational consumer, time-consistent consumption behavior. In this model, non-smokers potentially are better off because they're less exposed to passive smoke, while smokers are potentially worse off because their opportunity set is restricted. If we apply a behavioral economics model where consumers have limited willpower, they might act in a time-inconsistent manner. Here I've mentioned some references. I will come back to that. Non-smokers we also expect to be better off, but even smokers might potentially be better off if, for example, a smoking ban serves as a self-control device, and the same has been argued actually for cigarette taxes as a kind of an optimal syntax. So we will try to get a little bit, at least, at these two perspectives. So how are smokers and non-smokers affected? And if cigarette prices are higher, or if a smoking ban is introduced. And of course, there's a challenge here. I mean, if there are behavioral consequences of the smoking ban, not the same people are smokers and non-smokers after the ban has been introduced. And so we have a selection problem when we try to actually measure the effects on these two groups. So what we do here, we actually are not studying the effects for actual smokers on non-smokers, but we calculate for every person a probability that she or he is a smoker. And so we have people who have the typical characteristics in a country to be a smoker, and then we have other people who are less likely to be smokers. And then we study for, depending on this propensity to be a smoker, the effects on the policies. I've explained that already. And this is the result. So when we study the effect of the smoking ban for the first quartile, that is, those people who are characterized as being least likely to smoke, so we don't find an effect here, we find or potentially negative, we find a small positive effect here, but with a very large confidence interval, so we can't say whether this is actually statistically significantly different from zero. For higher cigarette prices, here we find now a clear negative effect for the people in the top quartile. Now the effect for a 50% price increase, and we observed that in our sample clearly over this time period, the reduction in life satisfaction is about 1/4 of the difference between employed and unemployed people. Now, who might potentially benefit? Oh yeah, that's sufficient. Who might potentially benefit? According to the behavioral economics model, we would like to catch the people who are marginal smoker, wannabe quitters, who actually just quit smoking and would like to have a device that helps them not to start again. So how do we approach this? We again take data from the Eurobarometer to assess or to try to get an idea who are the people who actually try to give up smoking in the last 12 months. And so we calculate for every person a propensity that is a smoker, a non-smoker, or such a wannabe quitter. And now let me explain that here. So we again studied the effect of the policy measures on different groups. So first group here, so the intervention is the ban for the non-smokers, the smokers, and the marginal smokers. So those who are most likely to be marginal smokers. And what we get for the ban, no statistically significant effect still for these two groups, but for the group of marginal smokers, we actually get a positive effect. So they seem to benefit from the introduction of a smoking ban. In comparison, whether you're a marginal smoker or a smoker, higher prices reduce your life satisfaction. So let me conclude. I would like to first start with a summary of what we have found with regard to our application to preventive health policy. For cigarette prices, we find a negative effect that is quite large. It seems, I mean, higher cigarette prices in Europe means higher taxes. I mean that the underlying taxes are higher, so this seems to be also a rather regressive tax. We don't find overall systematic effect for smoking bans. When we study these two approaches or perspectives that we have in economics, the traditional versus the behavioral approach, we actually find a large negative effect of prices for people with a high propensity to smoke. This is quite the opposite to a prominent finding in the literature for the US by Jonathan Gruber and Sendhil Molanaisen. But we find marginal smokers to benefit from smoking bans, but to suffer from higher cigarette prices. What is the interpretation here? So net effects for the overall population hide differential effects for specific populations. There is also a differential effectiveness of tobacco policies as collective self-binding mechanisms, while in the literature often prices are even proposed as a more flexible restriction helping people to smoke less. We actually find that smoking bans are successful, and this would fit the models of cue-triggered decision-making in addiction that was proposed by Douglas Bernheim and Antonio Rangel. Overall, I think this kind of happiness data allow us or provide a valuable tool for research in health economics, in particular for health policy evaluation. And this, to qualify that even further, is in particularly interesting when behavioral reactions are difficult to interpret. And this is certainly the case with smoking behavior. There might be trade-offs here with life expectancy, and that's why I would not propose this as an overall assessment, not at all. So, but this is just for the current evaluation in terms of life satisfaction. We get an idea, and then we might trade off this with the effect of these same policies on people's longevity. Finally, of course, we could now also try within the same approach to not only calculate the marginal effect of a policy on people's life satisfaction, but also the marginal effect of income on people's life satisfaction. And then we could even add such information in a cost-benefit analysis. Thank you very much.
Okay, so as you heard already, what I will do now is to present the appendix to Mark's presentation in the plenary session. And I will go a bit more deeply into the concept of equivalent incomes and be a little bit more technical. So this is the same joke as he made, so I can skip. What I do is what I present is joint work in progress with a lot of people, including Mark. Let me first explain why it is interesting and important to go beyond health when we talk about priority setting, because I will focus really on the topic of priority setting evaluation in a health economic context. First, what are the main challenges facing policymakers? I think the main challenge is increasing healthcare expenditures and the feeling that this put very heavy pressure on government budgets and that something should be done about this. And this position is very often taken by non-health economists, by macroeconomists who are not even interested in health, to be honest. While we know, of course, that on the other hand, there are good reasons to think that health expenditures also increase welfare, certainly in a richer society. I always like to use this quote of Hall and Jones. These are two Chicago economists, definitely non-suspect people. And the quote is, as we get older and richer, which is more valuable, a third car, yet another television, more clothing, or an extra year of life? And I can tell you, when you grow older, the answer becomes clearer and clearer. What is the most important thing? So we have to think about trade-offs between, on the one hand, consumption, and on the other hand, about health. And to think about these trade-offs, we need a broader concept to be used in our economic evaluation exercises. That's the first challenge. Second challenge is distribution. I think there's no doubt that healthcare expenditures will keep increasing in all Western rich countries. That's not the issue. The issue is, will we keep financing them through our collective systems, or will part of these expenditures be financed in a private way? That's the real question. Now, if we keep them within the collective system, as many of us, I think, would like, then it's very likely that there will be a differentiated structure of co-payments, that we will start making distinctions between rich and poor people, for instance, in the amount they have to pay. So there is a distribution issue. So these distributional considerations should be taken up in the economic evaluation, because the way we finance the new treatments and the way we distribute the burden of financing over the population will become an important aspect in taking our decisions. So we need to introduce distributional aspects in the analysis. Now, if we want to do this, some people would say, okay, let's put distributional weights in a quality type analysis. But from the equity point of view, this is, I think, really not sufficient. Another quote by a big name, Dan Hausman, stating that basically, you can read it yourself, so I'm not going to read it. You can read it, basically saying that we have to combine income and health when we want to evaluate equity. And this also is a point that was already made by Mark in his first plenary presentation. So in one way or another, we first have to construct an index of the quality of life of individuals, incorporating many dimensions and not only health. And then there's another step where we're going to aggregate these quality of life indicators for the different individuals. Let me, for those of you who are very active in economic evaluation, let me formulate it in a constructive way. I think that what people are now doing as economic evaluation can be very useful, but if you agree with me that these two are important challenges, at least we need also a technique which can help us answering these challenges. And cost effectiveness analysis as it's done now will not be helpful in answering these questions. So we need something more. So if we need something more, then the first step and the first question is indeed, is it possible to construct such an individual measure of well-being that can be made operational for economic evaluation? Because I think it's important to think about how to make it operational if we really want to apply it. And as Mark suggested, I think this is really a normative question, not a psychological or a quasi-metaphysical question. When you see about the history of happiness, you see all this metaphysical and religious interpretation of happiness that have been proposed in history, all of them very interesting. But we are not looking for kind of psychological or metaphysical concept. We want a normative concept, something which can be used in the economic evaluation exercises. And the question we want to answer is, when do we think that a transfer from someone with a high level of well-being to someone with a low level of well-being is welfare improving? Okay, that's the kind of concept of well-being we would like to get in order to apply in an evaluation exercise. So the question now is, we have all these dimensions of life that are important. There is health, there is income, there is the environment, there are many other things, job satisfaction, certainly underestimated very often by economists. You have all these dimensions, and the idea is now we first have to aggregate them at the individual level, because there are correlations. It also mentioned by Mark, I mean, it's the poor people that are at the same time sick, for instance. So we need first to aggregate at the level of the individual. How to do that? One possibility, one idea would be to say, okay, let's give individuals the opportunities to realize their own life project. Let's respect their preferences. I come back to the interpretation of preferences later on. I refer here to Rawls, who would say, okay, autonomous moral agents must get the freedom and assume responsibility of pursuing their own personal conception of the good life. It's very difficult to think about, and we can talk about that when we talk about the capabilities issue, it's very difficult to think about an approach which would respect human dignity and at the same time would not respect people's ideas about what they themselves consider to be important. It's very difficult to reconcile this. So it seems much more natural to say if we respect human dignity, we should also respect what people themselves think is important in life. And we can call these preferences. Now I will formalize this a bit also to compare it with capabilities objective approaches and with happiness approaches. Let Li denote a vector of aspects of life. I think you can understand what I say without the notation, but if I give the notation and I do something more formal, it looks more serious. And for the people who understand it, it makes things much clearer, I think. So let Li denote a vector of the aspects of life that are important. Individuals have a life project, and this is an informed judgment about what makes a life good or bad, and that we call preferences. Okay? So it's an informed judgment about what makes a life good or bad, not one of the very many other interpretations that have often been given to preferences. Subjective individual satisfaction is given by a satisfaction function, and I will come back to the relation between the satisfaction function and these preferences later on. And basically we would like to know if an individual has a life which we describe as Li, has an judgment about what he considers, or he or she, sorry, considers to be important in life represented by Ri, and has a satisfaction function Si. Now how to rank them? Who is better off? Remember the normative interpretation. So when do we want to redistribute from someone at a higher level of well-being to someone at a lower level of well-being? And one can formalize this idea to say, okay, we call this in our work personal preference principle, basically saying take two individuals that have, or one individual, the same individual, that has preferences, that has a satisfaction function, okay? Now we compare two bundles, an L and L prime. Okay, we would agree that the individual we say that individual that has the bundle L is better off than the individual that has the bundle L prime, or an individual is better in L than in L prime if he or she thinks, feels, informed judgments that he or she is better off in L than in L prime. Okay, we follow the ideas about individuals, about their own lives. So I want to return, because this is there's a lot of confusion in the literature on the concept of preferences. It was very striking that after Mark's presentation, Alois raised the first question and say, if I understand it correctly, what you do is based on behavior. Mark did not even mention that it was based on behavior. He did not say that at all. But this was the automatic reaction, because very many people, very many economists at least, would say preferences are revealed preferences, is what is revealed in behavior. This is not the concept of preferences, not necessarily the concept of preferences that is underlying this analysis, or these normative ideas. So the preferences that we refer to are people's authentic ideas about what is important in life. These are not always revealed in their choice behavior, because people make mistakes, they are poorly informed. There's a real difference between these two notions. Okay? Sometimes they coincide, very often they do not. And in order not to create any confusion, I want to emphasize that when we talk about preferences, it's these ideas about what is important in life for individuals. Yeah? Okay, so now we have these bundles. And suppose you agree, for the sake of the argument, that individuals have ideas about what is important in their lives, and that when aggregating the different dimensions, health, income, or whatever, okay, when aggregating these different dimensions, we will try to respect their own ideas about what they consider to be important in life, because this means respecting their human dignity. Now, this has strong consequences. And it's well known in the literature that, for instance, there is a conflict between this personal preference principle and something which is intuitively very attractive and was first proposed by Sen in Commodities and Capabilities, in fact. He said, okay, if people have different ideas about what should we do, how to make progress, probably it's impossible to make a complete ordering of all situations, but at least, and I call this here the dominance principle in the specific case where there are monotonic preferences, if one individual is better off in all dimensions than another individual, then certainly she's better off, okay? If I have more income, I'm more healthy, my job satisfaction is larger, I live in a better natural environment, then certainly I'm better off, okay? And this is a principle, I think, which has a very strong intuitive appeal, and it is conflicting with the personal preference principle. And this is such an easy thing to show, but so striking that I like to show it over and over again, but because I think it really illustrates the strength of the personal preference principle, and also, you might say, the problems in which we run if we want to follow it. Okay, but I'm in favor of following it, but we should be aware of the consequences. Okay, take that situation. You have two individuals. The individuals we have two indifference curves. Okay, I hope you can read what is there. Okay, now let's do the following reasoning. This Li is better than Lj on the two dimensions. So this should be a better situation than this one. Okay? This is equally good as this one because they are on the same indifference curve for that individual. So if we want to respect preferences, they should be equally good. This one is better than this one because it's better on all dimensions. That's the dominance principle. And this one is equally good as that one because they are on the same indifference curve. And we have a cycle. I mean, it's impossible to rank them. There's a real conflict. If we want to satisfy the dominance principle and at the same time respect the personal preference principle, this is impossible. We have to choose. So if you want to follow objective approaches, like I think more or less proposed in the talk about capabilities, then you cannot satisfy the personal preference principle. This is the first normative choice. So if you say human dignity means respecting individuals' preferences, the dominance principle cannot be accepted. I come back and I will give a summary at the end of what are the pros and the cons of the different approaches, and then you choose. A couple of years ago, 10 years ago I suppose, something like that, in social choice, many of us were very happy that utilitarianism was out. There had been a long discussion on utilitarianism and on the pros and cons of utilitarianism, and there was more or less a consensus that utilitarianism was not the way to go. I mean, at least in social choice. In actual practice, most economists still were utilitarian. But the people who thought about what is a good welfare criterion would not be utilitarian anymore. And then came the happiness revolution. And the happiness revolution basically, if interpreted in a simple way, is a revival of utilitarianism. Okay? Because, I mean, you could say the literature still only tries to explain where happiness comes from or feelings of people, but there's very often an implicit suggestion that making more happiness is always better. Okay? But this is self-evident. No, more happiness is always better. And this happiness literature in its applied work almost never, certainly there are exceptions, but almost never refers to the social choice literature and to the debate on utilitarianism that had been taking place before. Now the old sense arguments against utilitarianism or welfarism in more general, of course, still hold, I think, or at least deserve some discussion from the people that want to use happiness as a measure of well-being. First, Sen claimed that valuing a life is a reflective activity and that the content of a life is a crucial determinant of its value. Okay? And this is a quote by John Stuart Mill that I like a lot. It's better to be a human being dissatisfied than a pig satisfied. Better to be Socrates dissatisfied than a fool satisfied. Because if the fool or the pig is of a different opinion, it's because they only know their own side of the question. The other party to the comparison knows both sides. Happiness, well-being is not only about feelings. It is about valuing what is important in life. And there's a second argument by Sen, which is called physical condition neglect. The mental attitudes of a person do not sufficiently take into account the real physical conditions. And in fact, the happiness literature has given a lot of evidence that people indeed adapt to their situation. And the question is, what do we do when people really adapt? Deaton finds that countries with higher rates of HIV do not systematically report a lower level of life satisfaction. Even individuals, most individuals who really care about HIV and would prefer not to suffer from it. Individuals who have lost a limb may after adaptation recover a very good subjective well-being score, but they still express a strong aversion to disability. And there's a lot of very striking results showing that people adapt. And then the question is, what to do if people adapt? Again, we can formalize this. It was also mentioned by Mark. Let's now suppose that we want to respect preferences, and let's look at what are the consequences of respecting preferences. And we call this the same preference principle. Now take two individuals that have the same preferences, but they have a different satisfaction function. And let's now see what happens. And the idea is that life satisfaction in this case will not respect preferences. I can best immediately turn to an example. Take two individuals, I and J. They have the same preferences, okay? Individual I is in A and individual J is in B. A is on a higher indifference curve than B. If we want to respect preferences, I think we all agree that the individual in A is better off than the individual. They both agree, in fact, that A is better than B, okay? So the point of that same preference principle would be that in that case, we should say that the individual in A is better than the individual in B. Does this follow from happiness? No, not necessarily, because of the scaling problem that was mentioned by Mark. It's very well possible, and I simply give numbers to illustrate, that individual I gives a utility level 5 to the higher indifference curve and a utility level, a satisfaction level 3 to the lower indifference curve. That's fine. That represents the ordering. That for individual J, it's 9 for the higher indifference curve, 7 for the lower indifference curve. So if we look at the satisfaction data, we would have to say J is better off than I. Although individual J is in a situation that both individuals consider to be worse. Okay? So again, I'm not arguing that you should not use happiness data. I'm arguing that if you want to respect preferences, there is a deep conflict, and the suggestion which is often made in the happiness literature, that if you want to respect preferences, do happiness, that this is wrong. This is just wrong. This is just wrong. There is a choice to be made. Okay? Either you respect individual preferences, or you go for individual satisfaction levels. If you do the second, if you follow the second approach, you will have to take into account notions of adaptation. So you basically accept that if people adapt, they are well off, to formulate it in this way. This does not mean that happiness data or satisfaction data are uninteresting. In fact, I think that many of these approaches are complementary, rather than we should not always pitch them one against another. Nothing is, as said, is a criticism on the positive research on explaining happiness. Feelings of happiness, and in fact that was also mentioned by Sen, is undoubtedly one of the important dimensions of life, but only one of the dimensions of life that also will be traded off against the other dimensions by individuals. And satisfaction regressions, was also mentioned by Alois, can be used to derive information on preferences. Okay? So, but then we do not use the scale values that are the direct answers on the satisfaction question. We use satisfaction regressions as shown, in fact, to derive, for instance, willingness to pay. Okay, we can do this, and then we derive information on preferences. 2 minutes. I can be very short on equivalent income because this was explained brilliantly by Mark this morning. What I want to emphasize is that equivalent income is a concept that does respect preferences and does respect the same preference principle, and therefore is not subject to this kind of critiques. Okay? And it basically works. We choose reference values for all the non-income dimensions, and then the equivalent income is defined as that income which, combined with the reference situation for all the dimensions is equally, brings the individual in a situation that is equally good as a situation in which that individual actually is. This is was Mark's illustration, except that I have put health and income, so we did not coordinate everything. So health and income, the horizontal and the vertical axes are different, but the notion is exactly the same, so I do not have to repeat this, I think. Okay? But that's the idea of equivalent incomes. So I will not interpret the basic choice of reference values. We basically say when all individuals are in the reference situation for the non-income dimensions, then differences in preferences do not matter. And normal health, perfect health, is a natural reference value in the case of health. Okay? And then equivalent income, and this I think is a nice concept. Equivalent income basically is measuring or takes into account the welfare loss for individuals, the welfare loss that results from the fact that they are not in that normal level. Okay? That's, I think, for me, this is the easiest way to understand it. You have income. It's not an income concept, definitely not. You have income, you subtract from that income the welfare loss measured in money terms, the welfare loss that results because people are not in the reference situation. For instance, people are not in the perfect health situation. So that's basically the notion of equivalent income. Let me emphasize again, this is measured in monetary terms, but definitely it's not an income measure in the sense that it's not true that individuals that have a larger income always would be better off in terms of equivalent income. Definitely not. Okay, important to mention. Yeah, it takes into account preferences because in that willingness to pay, we basically take into account the curvature of the indifference curves, as was also shown already by Mark this morning. So we take into account preferences, but only marginal rates of substitution, the ordinal nature of preferences, not the values. Yeah, and definitely it's not a monetary measure. Let me summarize. Let's compare 4 approaches, and I let you choose. Okay? You can have functionings approaches. Functionings and capabilities, that's another nice debate, because capabilities looks very attractive, but capabilities, when you give a large weight to freedom of choice of individuals, you also give a large responsibility to individuals. So if they make the wrong choices in a good capability set, wow, it's up to them. Yeah? Whatever, we can discuss this if there's room for discussion. We have functioning, we have feelings of happiness, we have life satisfaction, and we have equivalent income. The dominance principle, remember, if an individual is better off on all dimensions than another one, then he is better off, will only be satisfied by objective approaches, not necessarily by happiness, not necessarily by life satisfaction, not by equivalent incomes. The idea that what I call the personal preference principle, we respect individuals' ideas about what is important in life, not satisfied by functionings, not satisfied by happiness as feeling, because we suppose that individuals are also interested in other dimensions of life, is satisfied by life satisfaction, and is satisfied by equivalent income. The same preference principle, remember, if there is a conflict between scaling and preferences, the same preference principle is only satisfied by equivalent income. So if you say, okay, it's part of respecting human dignity that we respect what people consider to be important in lives, then there are good reasons to go for equivalent income. And let me repeat once again, these are not necessarily the preferences as revealed in behavior. Okay, this is what individuals consider to be important in life. I have -1 minute. So I will not go into an empirical application, although this was very interesting. I simply say that there are different ways to estimate preferences. We can do revealed preferences if we believe that behavior reveals preferences, but this will only be true in, I think, in fact, in exceptional cases and rarely in the case of health. Because, I mean, also we do not choose our own health. So the relative importance we give to health has to be derived, if we derive it from behavior, has to be derived in very indirect ways, okay? It can be based on satisfaction data, and we derive willingness to pay from satisfaction data. It can be based on contingent valuation or discrete choice approaches. All 3 of these approaches have advantages, and all 3 of these approaches have disadvantages. This was the result for a stated valuation exercise. These are the indifference curves that Mark was showing. I skip all this, you see what you're missing. what one can derive from that is distributional weights, okay? They were mentioned in Mark's presentation. So we did this contingent valuation exercise in France, and now we derive distributional weights, the weights given to the that have to be given to the individuals if you do cost-benefit analysis with distributional weights, depending on their age, depending on their self-reported health, depending on whether they're male or female, depending on their income. By the way, the differences in the weights between age groups and between males and females follow from the fact that we estimate a model where the preferences are different for males and females and for the different age groups. So this reflects differences in preferences. Let me conclude. The role of the analyst is not to deliver a technocratic answer to deep social questions, but to produce useful information that can structure the debate within a transparent procedure. I suppose many of you are familiar with the Daniels and Sabin idea of accountability for reasonableness. I like this a lot, but it's very incomplete, okay? But it describes a procedure, and I think the procedure is a necessary but not sufficient condition. So suppose you have a procedure, then what can be our role? What can be the role of the analyst? The role of the analyst should be to give useful information to structure the debate. If we want to do this, we have to use a framework that is sufficiently rich to create room for sensitivity analysis about, for instance, inequality aversion, possibly about non-consequentialist considerations that very often also occur in a context of bioethics and so. Yeah? So we should use a framework that is sufficiently rich, because otherwise we really are narrowing down the debate. We should open the debate. The risk is, of course, that we then do sensitivity analysis with respect to values. And perhaps the decision makers do not want this. Perhaps some analysts want to give specific answers without any normative sensitivity analysis, but I think we should have a framework that is sufficiently rich to create room for sensitivity analysis about values. And this means that traditional cost-effectiveness analysis is too narrow to contribute to that debate, because it does not give a clue to start thinking about important challenges. We need a broader concept of well-being, and one of the possibilities which can be made operational, and easier to make operational in fact than the capabilities approach and ISCAP, and so the applications of the capability approach come very close to equivalent income, except that we have that aggregation step based on individual preferences. I think equivalent income is a notion that is worthwhile to consider.
Right, you will see that the title is slightly different from the one that was announced in the programme, and I've added the word somewhat myopic, not because I just realised that I need my glasses to be here. It's to put it a bit in context, because we've heard 3 talks on 3 major different schools of thought that might have something to contribute to health economics, but probably not in the short run. So we're not talking about changing the way health technology assessment happens next year, but we're talking about something to keep in mind, something to go on debating about, and the 3 speakers have given a longer vision story, I think. And so I thought I'll pull everything together from a slightly myopic perspective. And so I'm going to restrict myself to talk about the implications of the 3 schools in terms of health technology assessment. Now, a slight problem is I've never done an economic evaluation in my life. So I think I know what health technology assessment is about, but I only know the textbook version. So with that caveat, oh, and another thing you don't know is that I've asked the 3 speakers beforehand a little questionnaire, and I asked them to answer a few questions, and you'll get to see the questions and the answers a bit later on. So the aim of what I'm going to do now is to compare across the capabilities, the happiness and the equivalent income approaches from an HTA perspective, specifically, with the caveat that I'm not the best person to be doing this, it's going to be somewhat myopic in the sense that I'm going to deliberately restrict where the conversation is going. The three speakers may want to expand it later on. And I'm going to use as the reference case, or the default position, a cost per quality analysis or cost effectiveness analysis using the EQ5D as the health-related quality of life indicator. So that's the default case, the baseline. I think a lot of people agree that this is a very limited tool. So there are lots of things that EQ5D will not capture, and a lot of people are worried about how it's restricted. It doesn't mean that EQ5D needs to go out. Oh, and I should declare an interest. I'm a member of the Eurocall group. So back to where we are. A lot of people agree that using CEA with EQ5D for qualies is not going to solve every single problem out there. There are lots of cases where it is useful and it has been used, but whether we want to stick with it forever, especially the given interest, I don't know the UK context, but given interest in expanding economic evaluation into public health interventions, social care interventions, there are lots of things that EQ5D is not the best measure for. So the questionnaire that I sent to the three speakers consisted of a few questions, like, is the measure you're talking about, is it consequentialist? Does it trade off across multiple dimensions, or does it have multiple dimensions? And if it does it trade off across multiple dimensions? Can it be used in a clinical population? Can it be combined with survival data? Does it have mortality in there? Can it be combined with survival data? Is the measure interpersonally comparable? Is the measure cardinal measurable? And can it be compared? Can the aggregation of it incorporate distributional weights, or can it have distributional concerns built in it? And can it address allocative efficiency? And I got different responses. So one person just sent me a very short outline without specifying which bit of their reply corresponded to which question that I had to walk my way through, and I may have got it wrong. And the other two have given me a very simple set of questions for me to summarize in the table. So at a glance, the default quali with EQ5D type of economic evaluation, or HTA, EQ5D or qualies. Let's do qualies. Qualies is consequentialist, yes. It has multiple dimensions and it trades off between them, yes. It's used in clinical populations, or it is devised for clinical populations, although with the caveat that not all clinical conditions are suited, or the other way around. EQ5D is not suited for the use in all possible clinical conditions. Does it combine survival? Yes, the quali can combine survival. Interpersonal? Yes, with a W. The W here means that we don't assume. Suppose you are going to have a medical treatment which is going to give you 3 qualies gained over your lifetime, and somebody else is going to have 2.9 qualies gained over their lifetime. We're not saying that what you are going to gain as judged by yourself is more than what the other person is going to gain as judged by the other person. So it's an interpersonal comparability at the normative level, or at the social welfare level, where we say we assume, or we are going to give more value to the fact that you're going to gain 3 qualies and the other person is going to gain 2.9 qualies. We're not talking about the value of health to you, the value of your health to you versus the value of somebody else's health to that somebody else. We're talking about the social value of your health versus the social value of health to somebody else. Cardinal, yes. Distribution, possible, although it's not done. We've been talking about it, or a few of us have been talking about it for donkey's years. It's not getting anywhere. And allocative. We know that cost-benefit analysis is the one that allows you to do allocative efficiency. Cost-effectiveness analysis cannot do allocative efficiency in the proper sense, unless you bring in a threshold value and then assume that every single person in the community signs up to that threshold value that we empirically know is not true. So possible, but not really. Capabilities. Well, okay, this is what I've pulled together. But in the interest of time, I'm not going to talk through the whole table. What I'm going to do is I'm going to focus on these 3 rows and spend a couple of minutes each to go through these. And I know that at least one person, one of the 3 authors, three speakers is not happy with the way I've summarised their response, so I hope they'll be given time to come back and challenge the way I've summarised what I thought they said. So, survival. Let's start from the easy one. Equivalent income. Does equivalent income combine survival? Can it combine with survival? And if we use health equivalent income, we would need a reference for health. And both the talks of Mark and Eric assumed that health was health-related quality of life, basically. Your health now. Perfect health. Yes, you can imagine what is perfect health. Can you imagine perfect health in the quality sense? So you can do the quality adjustment bit. How long should a perfect health last? And you may have figured out from the figure, it's a bad idea to have the health reference not at the maximum level, because if you have people lying beyond the maximum level and the indifference curves interact, you get into a messy situation. So can you do survival and equivalent income? I think it needs a bit of work. Happiness and capabilities, can it be combined with survival? Both also have replied yes, meaning that you can have survival. No, let's do them one by one. Capabilities can incorporate survival in the sense that it is one of the attributes, one of the things, a capability, that you have a healthy and long and healthy life. So if you had two people with the identical capability set, but one person is going to die earlier than the other, then you assume that the first person has a larger capability set. But it's not there in the sense of whatever it is that is happening to your well-being now instantaneously multiplied by iteration. Maybe that's a fundamentally wrong way to go about the problem, but if we're thinking about incremental changes from the current quality model, and if we stick to that model, then whether capabilities can be used in that particular way is not clear. And this is where the happiness and the capabilities come similar. The issue being, can you identify a point at which the well-being index becomes 0? Can you meaningfully define a state at which surviving in that for longer doesn't increase your lifetime well-being, as it were? And I don't think the capabilities literature or the happiness literature has addressed it as an interesting point. So you can say 3 units of happiness for 5 years is better than 5 units of happiness for the same duration. But when you start trading off between survival, and you mentioned one of the things that you might want to trade off between subjective well-being and survival, I don't think my understanding is that it's not there yet. And especially if it's reported subjective well-being, you will have to have survey data from people who regard themselves as being in a state that is equivalent to being dead, and they might not want to answer your survey question at that point. So that was the survival bit. Interpersonal comparison, I've already mentioned why this W is there for the default position. Capability is similar in the sense that it comes from outside. So we can compare your capability with my capability. It doesn't mean the value of your capability to you versus the value of my capability to me. Happiness, no, yes, empirically okay. That's a question that Eric's addressed, so I'm not going to do it. Yes, equivalent income, it's yes, in the sense that an equivalent income of, say, 20,000 euros is 20,000 euros, regardless of whether it's for you or for me. And we're talking about the value of 20,000 euros to you versus the value of 20,000 euros to me. So they are directly comparable at the level of utilities. Cardinal capabilities. When I sent out the questionnaire, Sridhar came back saying, yeah, well, it's kind of possible, but Sen's already pointed out that you don't need full cardinality, or fixing the interpersonal comparability is more important than fixing the cardinality, for probably in the context of arrow, but anyway. So that was his rebuttal, fine. And happiness, it's not there as theory, but empirically it seems to be okay, to which Eric has counter examples. Equivalent income, yes, in the sense that 20,000 euros is 20 times more than 1,000 euros. But if we interpret it as a cardinal measure of well-being, are we assuming that if somebody earns £1 million, earns more than £1 million, but after the equivalent value and equivalent income, their equivalent income is one, let's make it bigger. Assume somebody has an equivalent income of £10 million, 10 million euros. is that person 1 million times better off than somebody whose equivalent income is £10? And I don't know. So that's my question mark. So those are the three things that I addressed. I know that there'll be more to discuss, but I think I'm going to call it a day now, and this is my wrap up. Thank you.
In fact, Aki, you have made a great job, because that's something that I could have done once we listen the three presentations. I wonder whether other speakers want to answer or to comment any of the question marks from Aki. Eric?
Only one, because
Only
I
one?
was the guy that was I did not give a student type answer to all the questions, and Aki put a question mark for survival and longevity, but Mark basically has answered the question in his plenary. So I mean, equivalent income can take into account, I think, longevity and survival. So, but I have to be blamed because I was not sufficiently disciplined to give a nice, clean answer to Aki's questions.
After Mark's presentation, that this question mark would be...
No, I would still
Very
stick with
nice.
the question mark for the reason that I think it will make setting the reference extremely difficult. Well, not extremely difficult, I mean difficult.
Can I? So I want to say two things. One, I want to say that Aki did a fantastic job, and I really appreciated the questions, and I thought she did a very fair summary of it. The second thing I want to say is that I totally thought that these were unfair questions. I thought that it's very unfair because what the questions were is how like QALYs is your approach, yeah? And so I'm like, well, the whole point that I'm trying to set another approach is that I'm saying that the QALY approach is a bad one. It's something that we're making do, and therefore you're asking me questions is how like are you to the one that we use, which is not good enough and we're not very happy with it. So it just seemed very odd that we're actually not talking about the strengths of various things, but rather asking how like are you to the existing system. So I mean, I just wanted to, it may be an obvious point, but I often say obvious things, but I just wanted to say that.
So I don't have anything to add to the question mark, maybe then later to the presentations.
Let's then open the floor. Anyone willing to ask? Please, Elena.
Thank you for the presentation. And I would like to ask regarding the capabilities approach. My question is, whenever somebody is not able to do something, so in that case has any handicap or limitation, but then it could exist a tool that make these disabled people to be able to do the thing, is value the same? In other words, whenever you have some disabilities, there exists some type of adaptation in the house or some instruments that allow to recover the ability, so being able again. In these cases, is value the same or not? So how is the approach in these situations? Thank you.
Let me tell you that Elena is working with Ascot. Ascot was one of you.
So you should know the answer to this question. Okay, so the reason, so the light is on. So when you ask, is the value the same? I don't know what you mean, but let me think through your question stuff. So the reason why the capabilities approach is advantageous to use in that situation is that if you went with a life satisfaction approach, right? A person who is disabled and is no longer able to do something, but then their life satisfaction scores return to what they were before their accident or before their situation, then if you had a policy choice, you wouldn't actually intervene there because their life satisfaction is quite where it was before or as good. But from a capability perspective, you say that this person has lost in an absolute sense, a capability here that's valuable. So we would want to intervene in that particular situation, right? So it actually makes a difference here in the sense that you're actually saying what we're interested in is that people have that ability in terms of, so you were talking about disability. So very recently I've been working with people who, so it's not considered mental impairment, and it's sort of people experiencing mental distress. And this is a very difficult situation because you don't know what to do with people who are expressing certain views about their well-being when they are experiencing mental distress. So somebody has to make objective view about how to allocate resources or whether to intervene and all these other kinds of stuff. So it is this kind of situation where a capabilities approach would come into play, both because you have an ability to say, that they should be able to do something, and that becomes valuable itself. But the other thing that's really important is that when somebody who is recovering from mental distress, who's been institutionalized and something like that, if you use something like the EQ5D, you assume that they should be doing these 5 things, right? It's exhausting if you've been recovering from an illness that somebody comes to your house and says, we're going to now do these 5 things, yeah? And so capabilities approach is a little bit more freeing in the sense that, are you able to do these 5 things, and do you want to do them, can we do them? So it sort of offers you stuff. So there's lots of different kinds of advantages, particularly around disability, and so you obviously are working with it. But I don't know if that answered your question about, is it the same thing, but I just wanted to think through that question.
I think my point of view on this is that the distinction between capabilities and functionings is sometimes a bit oversold, let's say. The problems with capabilities as such are, first, it's very difficult to make them operational, because how to measure opportunities that must take into account situations that we do not observe. Second, you give a very large responsibility to people who make the wrong choices. Now, Sen himself has proposed notions like refined functionings or comprehensive outcomes, which basically is a description of functionings taking into account some freedom concepts. And I like these notions a lot, and I think basically the applications, I don't know your application, but for instance ISCAP, that's refined functionings or comprehensive outcomes. And I like this a lot. I mean, I like this more than the idea of having these capabilities as opportunity sets, where I think you give too much responsibility to the weak people that make perhaps wrong choices.
Joan Rovira, University of Barcelona. I have a question for Eric on the equivalent income approach, but maybe it also applies to the capabilities approach. The idea is that, as you say, the equivalent income approach requires some kind of definition of normal health, so as a reference. But my question is, maybe I didn't understand, but this is the best possible health, has to do with best or just the average, the normal? Then it's supposed to be the same kind of consensus or average state of health for all people, but what is the kind of normal, or is normal for each person which is judging, whatever you ask them to judge. And finally, for instance, is there a time dimension? For instance, you consider normal for certain age, or you consider normal for all ages?
This is a very difficult question. Let me first say that in theory, we would choose as the reference value for all the dimensions, not only for health. I think the most attractive approach is to choose what people themselves consider to be for themselves the best outcome, in general, for all the dimensions. Now, health is a special case because we believe that preferences for health are monotonic. Everybody wants to become as healthy as possible. And then, of course, we come to your question, how to define what is normal health or best health. On your specific question, is there a time dimension? Yes, there definitely should be a time dimension, and I think this again boils down to Mark's comments on longevity and how to introduce longevity and so. I think I'm now not talking about our applications. I can tell you what we did in our applications. In our applications, we use self-assessed health, and we use the maximum value of self-assessed health as the reference. Yeah? But there's a lot of critique that can be raised with respect to self-assessed health, and in fact some of the scaling problems that I was referring to concerning happiness can also be raised with respect to self-assessed health. So in a certain sense, there is a lot of problems there. My idea would be that the best approach, but Mark can correct me if he does not agree, but my approach, the best approach would be to see health as a multidimensional phenomenon, and then indeed take into account also the preferences of, ask the individuals what they would consider to be the best value on all these different dimensions. But in actual practice, we are very far from that at the moment. So, so for instance, the notion of, it's for me an open question, in fact. This is an open research domain. Eh? It's an open question what to do with age, for instance. I think in the questionnaire we asked, considering your age, okay, now evaluate your self-assessed health. Now we know that people will choose their reference when they grow older. For me, perfect health is very different from all these youngsters that are here. The others are at the side of the table. So we know that if this is the question, I mean, we know that I will take this into account in my evaluation of self-assessed health, but that's what we did until now. Because the basic inspiration is, the reference should be what is the best for that individual, considered by that individual. And it can then be individual specific also. The theory does not change if can be applied if the reference is individual specific.
Laura Vallejo from University of La Laguna. So a question for the first presentation, maybe for all of you actually. But I think I understood from your presentation that one of the reasons for maybe the disagreement about which approach is best to measure health or individual welfare is that there is a bigger underlying disagreement about what health economics is about. So I will ask you to elaborate a bit on that, and maybe, I don't know if you are able to link each of these approaches to different objectives for health economics.
So just quickly, I think Aki very clearly stated this. She says, you know, I'm going to be talking about health technology assessment or economic evaluation of various technologies. I think a lot of people think that health economics is about that. It's about economic evaluation of particular clinical or health care technologies. I think that that is one very important aspect of health economics, but I think we've got a lot of other issues as well. So a second thing is this idea that in health economics we are very much focused on the individual and individual preferences, and health is not something that only resides in the individual. It's affected by interactions and community sort of health and community factors. And so we need to start examining health of populations, not as simply additive of individual health, but as entities themselves, and this raises lots of conceptual, ethical, and lots of other stuff. So that's one problem that we need to think about. The second thing is that we understand now much more than before that health is not just simply about, like the Americans, they think it's all about me and my choices, right? It's about personal responsibility and whether I do this good or bad. But we now understand that health is very much determined from the time that you are conceived all the way throughout your life by external factors, right? So in terms of the social environments, right, from point zero to all the way to when you die. So these range from not only your sort of personal relationships, your physical relationships, the material conditions, the psychosocial relationships, and the way that you're treated by other individuals affects you throughout your life course, right? But health economics we haven't started looking at those kinds of things. 3 sort of public health interventions are only, I can't believe that we're just looking at evaluating public health interventions that are complex, right? So we have lots of moving parts in complex public health interventions, and we have lots of outcomes, and we have to be able to evaluate different kinds of outcomes and say which one is better or not. So I could go on for that, but also the other really important thing is that we need to go beyond the national unit, right? We think about health as being somehow about national health policies, but health at this point, our health is affected by factors way beyond our borders, and we need to be able to understand and to think about these things from an economic point of view. So these are all aspects of health that we need to, I would like to see health economics to be more inclusive of.
So very briefly, I think another source for disagreement is that in a lot of exercises we are looking for the optimal policy intervention. And so we have to reconcile a lot of things when we try to figure out this optimal intervention. So we have heard distributional values is just one aspect. And we have this problem in welfare economics quite clearly. But there is, of course, an alternative here, and that would be to have more of a constitutional approach. So studying or applying a comparative institutional approach, focusing on basic rules and basic decision-making mechanisms, also in the healthcare area. And this differentiation might also apply to happiness research. So you can respond to these questions based on the utilitarian perspective of happiness research, trying to maximize almost naive happiness function, or you can apply the same approach as an empirical application of a constitutional, comparative institutional approach, trying to provide additional information about the effectiveness of alternative decision-making mechanisms or rules. And so I think this might be, so coming back, another source for disagreement.
So for me, health economics is economics, or should be economics, okay? Economics apply to health issues. I do not see why we would need a special or specific definition for health economics, except that it's economics applied to health issues. When we see the history, you understand why, because most economists were not very much interested in health because all these institutional details which made it too difficult. And I must also admit, 25 years ago, when health economists did economic theory, it was sometimes really lousy. Now I think health economics has become an adult discipline, so there's no need anymore to say it's very different from economics, because also economics has changed in these 25 years and improved. Okay, there's much more openness to, for instance, institutional issues. We know how to analyze it. So for me, health economics is just economics. When we apply it to health technology assessment and to the different approaches here at the table, my point of view would be that the basic function of health economics is to explore the different normative consequences of the different approaches. I was perhaps advocating one, but this is not the main idea. Is to let's explore the differences, and let's introduce different normative perspectives in health technology assessment, and then so that policymakers can make, in a good procedure, take the best decisions. I think that would be the role of health economists in health technology assessment.
I wanted to thank the organizers for having set up this session. It was really great to see this dialogue, and I think we should have more occasions for this sort of dialogue and to have it continued. I wanted to make a specific proposal about how to continue in one direction in which the dialogue could continue, which is about the issue of interpersonal comparability. And the discussion, the difference between Eric and Alois was interesting here. So Alois, in his talk, perhaps not in his answer to Aki's questionnaire, but in his talk he said, yes, we have interpersonal comparability of satisfaction data because when we look at how other people view the happiness of people, it seems to be consistent with their own view. And so there are indeed some grounds for being somewhat believers of some degree of comparability. And another kind of consideration that is brought by other people I've heard is, for instance, Andrew Clark, is that the behavior of people can be predicted from their happiness level. So, for instance, the probability of people quitting their job is connected to their satisfaction with their job. So, if behavior is connected to declarations of satisfaction, that shows that there is some degree of comparability across people as well. So that's good. But then, of course, that doesn't fully answer Eric's challenge, because the whether these things are comparable or not should be connected to the normative questions. If the right measure is something that should be decided on normative grounds, it's not sufficient. I mean, we cannot answer the question of interpersonal comparability just by looking at the data. We need to have a good metric of interpersonal comparison and check whether what we have with the satisfaction data fits that. And that becomes, and then Eric was a bit harsh, because then it depends on the data. Perhaps the data will tell us, in fact, it's good. Even if we believe in equivalent income, the satisfaction data tell us the right thing. So that becomes a nice empirical question. And I wanted to advertise the work that has been done by Koen de Konk and Dirk Neumann. They have done a study on the German socioeconomic panel, where they have looked at the satisfaction data, and they have computed essentially the 3 measures of well-being, and they have looked at the rank correlation between these measures. So there you see whether interpersonal comparisons are reversed or not with the different measures. And just very briefly, the kind of result they have is that income, which is not part of the 3, nobody is advocating income here. Income is badly correlated with the other measures, so it's good. I mean, it shows that income is not a good measure. We need to incorporate other dimensions. An objective approach, which is essentially a kind of application of functionings rather than a capability approach, is quite closely correlated with equivalent income, and also closely correlated to another approach which is proposed by Matthew Adler, which is not on this panel here. But the satisfaction data are poorly, less poorly than income, but somewhat poorly correlated with the capability or the equivalent income approach. So it suggests that the empirical answer to the question is, in fact, we should be careful. If we believe in things such as capabilities or equivalent income, then the satisfaction data do not give us the right comparison. So we have a positive correlation, so that's good. And so in a way, it's true that the arguments given by Alois and Andrew Clark prove that there is a positive correlation, but positive correlation may not be enough. It might be a bit too weak.
Thanks a lot for this comment. I think this is really a challenge, because what do you take from these correlations? There, at the beginning in happiness research, whenever something was different than in traditional economics, then this was an indication, oh, they missed something with these other measures. And then there were the other people, no, whenever we show that there are correlations, this actually validates our approach. But of course, this is complete nonsense, because we don't know the true normative reference standard that we would like to apply. We know for all these approaches that they have shortcomings. So it's actually fascinating to see how these exercises are going on. And so I think we can't solve it. And so the alternative would then, in fact, be to have specific applications like the ones you have brought up here, these health technology assessments, and to see how different approaches perform specifically for the problem, or specifically for the problem of health regulations. For example, obesity, anti-obesity policies, how are they evaluated based on the different approaches? And then we don't have to take a stand, but we just get informed, ideally from a panel, what the different approaches deliver.
We are close to the end, but I wonder whether Aki would agree with this proposal that we should take different approaches in HTA, and according to the field we are evaluating. But that has been raised by Alois. But the other questions that I would like to hear from you is, why do you think that Qualis have not succeed in introducing distributional weights? Because you at some stage you told us that there was a failure so far on the job you are doing, and Nacho is your co-author introducing weights, distributional weights.
if I've understood you correctly,
The proposal
so-
from Alois
yes,
that
I think
they-
what Alois, you're saying is that as an intellectual exercise, we should set ourselves a particular context against a particular background against which to compare the different schools, rather than to compare them across in a complete open arena.
May I very briefly briefly qualify? I mean this as that this information that is created by this exercise would then actually be a valuable input from a constitutional economic perspective, because then decision makers or citizens can actually decide on this kind of information. So there's an underlying political philosophy background that this would be most beneficial for a constitutional approach.
Because the reason I wanted to confirm is because I don't think we're talking about, depending on what intervention it is, let's use a different approach. That might be on the table, but that would be a different debate, I think, because there's a meta-level discussion to be had about having different bits of the system using different approaches, which is what currently happens. So, for instance, in the UK, most of government activities have to go under the Green Book, and until a few years ago, there was no intention to reconcile between some areas of government where they wanted a monetary value of health and longevity, whilst NICE was saying it's okay not to have a monetary value of health, and now they come up with a kind of fudge. And so it's a different debate, I think. The pros and cons of individual approaches under different questions, and the debate about whether to have one approach or have different approaches is related. They are related, but they are different. So I'm not going that far at the moment yet. Why doesn't the current, for instance, the NICE reference case, to keep on sticking to the England case, not introduce distributional weights? That's the debate for tomorrow morning. I think we've got, I can see Gavin Roberts there at the background, and James Rafferty, you're part of the debate tomorrow, right? So I can't remember who else was on that debate, but there is a session tomorrow morning where we're going to discuss value-based pricing, and that would be the contest.
Okay.
But my personal take on this is that there's a number of us working on trying to incorporate equity weights into cost-effectiveness analysis. Compared to how the EQ5D was picked up by the Department of Health quite quickly and started using in additional analysis, well, the Department of Health actually funded the so-called MBH study, the Measurement and Evaluation of Health study, in the 1990s. That was carried out by York and produced the EQ5D so-called tariff. So it was almost like a policy-initiated action where the academics responded and delivered the research, and policy picked up and ran with it. Whilst I don't think we have been up to this point. Now, the interesting thing is the value-based pricing or approach in the UK, which, as I say, is the topic tomorrow morning.
Okay, thank you very much, Jackie. Tomorrow be more. Okay, the sequence follow. Let me thanks to all of our speakers with applause. Okay.
Shall I erase all these presentations?